reading The Theory of Film, The Redemption of Physical Reality by Siegfried Kracauer, Basic Concepts. Like the embryo in the womb, photographic film developed from distinctly separate components. Its birth came about from a combination of instantaneous photography, as used by Muybridge and Murray, with the older devices of the magic lantern and the phenakistoscope. Added to this later were the contributions of other non-photographic elements, such as editing and sound. Nevertheless, photography, especially instantaneous photography, has a legitimate claim to top priority among these elements, for it undeniably is and remains the decisive factor in establishing film content. The nature of photography survives in that of film. Originally, film was expected to bring the evolution of photography to an end, satisfying at last the age-old desire to picture things moving. This desire already accounted for major developments within the photographic medium itself. As far back as 1839, when the first daguerreotypes and talbotypes appeared, admiration mingled with disappointment about their deserted streets and blurred landscapes. And in the 50s, long before the innovation of the hand camera, successful attempts were made to photograph subjects in motion. The very impulses which thus led from time exposure to snapshot engendered dreams of a further extension of photography in the same direction. Dreams, that is, of film. About 1860, Cook and Bonelli, who had developed a device called a photobioscope, predicted a, quote, complete revolution of photographic art. We will see landscapes, end quote, they announced, quote, in which the trees bow to the whims of the wind, the leaves ripple and glitter in the rays of the sun, end quote. Along with the familiar photographic leitmotif of the leaves, such kindred subjects as undulating waves, moving clouds, and changing facial expressions ranked high in the early prophecies. All of them conveyed the longing for an instrument which would capture the slightest incidents of the world about us. Scenes that often would involve crowds whose incalculable movements resemble somehow those of waves or leaves. In a memorable statement published before the emergence of instantaneous photography, Sir John Herschel not only predicted the basic features of the film camera, but assigned to it a task which it has never since disowned, quote, the vivid and lifelike reproduction and handing down to the latest posterity of any transaction in real life, a battle, a debate, a public solemnity, a pugilistic conflict, end quote. Ducas du Heron and other forerunners also looked forward to what we have come to label newsreels and documentaries, films devoted to the rendering of real-life events. This insistence on recording went hand in hand with the expectation that motion pictures could acquaint us with normally imperceptible or otherwise induplicable movements, flash-like transformations of matter, the slow growth of plants, etc. All in all, it was taken for granted that film would continue along the lines of photography. To summarize, the preceding statements about photography also hold true of the cinematic medium, but they do not apply to it mechanically or go far enough to exhaust its potentialities. Elaborations and extensions are needed. They will be provided in the first 3 chapters, which represent an attempt to account for the general characteristics of the medium. The present chapter concentrates on the basic concepts underlying the subsequent analyses. The next chapter details the recording and revealing functions of film. The third deals with its particular affinities. This conceptual framework will later be filled in by inquiries into specific areas and elements of film and problems of film composition. Properties of the medium. The properties of film can be divided into basic and technical properties. The basic properties are identical with the properties of photography. Film, in other words, is uniquely equipped to record and reveal physical reality and hence gravitates toward it. Now, there are different visible worlds. Take a stage performance or a painting. They too are real and can be perceived. But the only reality we are concerned with is actually existing physical reality, the transitory world we live in. Physical reality will also be called, quote, material reality, end quote, or, quote, physical existence, end quote, or, quote, actuality, end quote, or loosely just, quote, nature, end quote. Another fitting term might be, quote, camera reality, end quote. Finally, the term, quote, life, end quote, suggests itself as an alternate expression for reasons which will appear in chapter 4. The other visible worlds reach into this world without, however, really forming a part of it. A theatrical play, for instance, suggests a universe of its own which would immediately crumble were it related to its real life environment. As a reproductive medium, film is, of course, justified in reproducing memorable ballets, operas, and the like. Yet, even assuming that such reproductions try to do justice to the specific requirements of the screen, they basically amount to little more than, quote, canning, end quote, and are of no interest to us here. Preservation of performances which lie outside physical reality proper is at best a sideline of mediums so particularly suited to explore that reality. This is not to deny that reproductions, say, of stage production numbers may be put to good cinematic use in certain feature films and film genres. Of all the technical properties of film, the most general and indispensable is editing. It serves to establish a meaningful continuity of shots and is therefore unthinkable in photography. Photomontage is a graphic art rather than a specifically photographic genre. Among the more special cinematic techniques are some which have been taken over from photography, e.g. the close-up, soft focus pictures, the use of negatives, double or multiple exposure, etc. Others, such as the lapse dissolve, slow and quick motion, the reversal of time, certain, quote, special effects, end quote, and so forth, are for obvious reasons exclusively peculiar to film. These scanty hints will suffice. It is not necessary to elaborate on technical matters which have been dealt with in most previous theoretical writings on film. Unlike these, which invariably devote a great deal of space to editing devices, modes of lighting, various effects of the close-up, etc., the present book concerns itself with cinematic techniques only to the extent to which they bear on the nature of film, as defined by its basic properties and their various implications. The interest lies not with editing in itself, regardless of the purposes it serves, but with editing as a means of implementing or defying, which amounts to the same, such potentialities of the medium as are in accordance with its substantive characteristics. In other words, the task is not to survey all possible methods of editing for their own sake. Rather, it is to determine the contributions which editing may take to cinematically significant achievements. Problems of film technique will not be neglected. However, they will be discussed only if issues going beyond technical considerations call for their investigation. This remark on procedures implies what is fairly obvious anyway, that the basic and technical properties differ substantially from each other. As a rule, the former take precedence over the latter in the sense that they are responsible for the cinematic quality of a film. Imagine a film which, in keeping with the basic properties, records interesting aspects of physical reality, but does so in a technical, imperfect manner. Perhaps the lighting is awkward or the editing uninspired. Nevertheless, such a film is more specifically a film than one which utilizes brilliantly all the cinematic devices and tricks to produce a statement disregarding camera reality. Yet this should not lead one to underestimate the influence of the technical properties. It will be seen that in certain cases, the knowing use of a variety of techniques may endow otherwise non-realistic films with a cinematic flavor. The two main tendencies. If film grows out of photography, the realistic and formative tendencies may be operative in it also. Is it by sheer accident that the two tendencies manifested themselves side by side immediately after the rise of the medium? As if to encompass the whole range of cinematic endeavors at the outset. Each went the limit, exhausting its own possibilities. Their prototypes were Lumiere, a strict realist, and Millet, who gave free rein to his artistic imagination. The films they made embody, so to speak, thesis and antithesis in a Hegelian sense. Lumiere and Millet. Lumiere's films contained a true innovation as compared with the repertoire of the zoetropes or Edison's peep boxes. They pictured everyday life after the manner of photographs. Some of his early pictures, such as Baby's Breakfast, La Déjeuner de Baby, or The Card Players, La Partie de Descartes testified to the amateur photographer's delight in family idols and genre scenes. And there was Teasing the Gardener, Arroseur, which enjoyed immense popularity because it elicited from the flow of everyday life a proper story with a funny climax to boot. A gardener is watering flowers and he unsuspectingly proceeds. An impish boy steps on the hose, releasing it at the very moment when his perplexed victim examines the dried up nozzle. Water squirts out and hits the gardener smack in the face. The denouement is true to style, with the gardener chasing and spanking the boy. This film, the germ cell and archetype of all film comedies to come, represented an imaginative attempt on the part of Lumiere to develop photography into a means of storytelling, yet the story was just a real-life incident, and it was precisely its photographic veracity which made Maxim Gorky undergo a shock-like experience. Quote, "You think," end quote, he wrote about Teasing the Gardener, quote, "the spray is going to hit you too, and instinctively shrink back," end quote. On the whole, Lumiere seems to have realized that storytelling was none of his business. It involved problems with which he apparently did not care to cope. Whatever storytelling films he or his company made, some were comedies in the vein of his first one, tiny historical scenes, etc., are not characteristic of his production. The bulk of his films recorded the world about us for no other purpose than to present it. This is in any case what Mesquich, one of Lumiere's quote ace end quote cameramen, felt to be their message. At a time when the talkies were already in full swing, he epitomized the work of the master as follows, quote, "As I see it, the Lumiere brothers had established the true domain of the cinema in the right manner. The novel, the theater, suffice for the study of the human heart. The cinema is the dynamism of life, of nature and its manifestations, of the crowd and of its eddies. All that asserts itself through movement depends on it. Its lens opens on the world," end quote. Lumiere's lens did open on the world in this sense. Take his immortal first reels, Lunch Hour at the Lumiere Factory, Sortie d'un scène Lumiere, Arrival of a Train, L'arrivée d'un train, La place des Cordeliers et Lyon. Their themes were public places with throngs of people moving in diverse directions. The crowded streets captured by the stereographic photographs of the late 50s thus reappeared on the primitive screen. It was life at its least controllable and most unconscious moments, a jumble of transient, forever dissolving patterns accessible only to the camera. The much imitated shot of the railway station, with its emphasis on the confusion of arrival and departure, effectively illustrated the fortuity of these patterns, and their fragmentary character was exemplified by the clouds of smoke which leisurely drifted upward. Significantly, Lumiere used the motif of smoke on several occasions, and He seemed anxious to avoid any personal interference with the given data. The text records his shots resembled the imaginary shot of the grandmother, which Proust contrasts with the memory image of her. Contemporaries praised these films for the very qualities which the prophets and forerunners had singled out in their visions of the film. It was inevitable that in the comments on Lumiere, quote, the ripple of leaves stirred by the wind, end quote, should be referred to enthusiastically. The Paris journalist Henri de Parville, who used the image of the trembling leaves, also identified Lumiere's overall theme as, quote, nature caught in the act, end quote. Others pointed to the benefits which science would derive from Lumiere's invention. In America, his camera realism defeated Edison's kinetoscope with its staged objects. Lumiere's hold on the masses was ephemeral. In 1897, not more than 2 years after he had begun to make films, his popularity subsided. The sensation had worn off. The heyday was over. Lack of interest caused Lumiere to reduce his production. George Millet took over where Lumiere left off. Renewing and intensifying the medium's waning appeal. That is not to say that he did not occasionally follow the latter's example. In his beginnings, he too treated the audience to sightseeing tours, or he dramatized, in the fashion of the period, realistically staged topical events. But his main contribution to the cinema lay in substituting staged illusion for unstaged reality and contrived plots for everyday incidents. The two pioneers were aware of the radical differences in their approach. Lumiere told Millet that he considered film nothing more than a, quote, scientific curiosity, end quote, thereby implying that his cinematograph could not possibly serve artistic purposes. In 1897, Millet, on his part, published a prospectus which took issue with Lumiere. Quote, Monsieur Millet and Rouleau specialized mainly in fantastic or artistic scenes, reproductions of theatrical scenes, etc., thus creating a special genre which differs entirely from the customary views supplied by the cinematograph, street scenes or scenes of everyday life, end quote. Millet's tremendous success would seem to indicate that he catered to demands left unsatisfied by Lumiere's photographic realism. Lumiere appealed to the sense of observation, the curiosity about, quote, nature caught in the act, end quote. Millet ignored the workings of nature out of the artist's delight in sheer fantasy. The train in Arrival of a Train is the real thing, whereas its counterpart in Millet's in Impossible Voyage, Voyage à travers l'impossible, is a toy train as unreal as the scenery through which it is moving. Instead of picturing the random movements of phenomena, Millet freely interlinked imagined events according to the requirements of his charming fairy tale plot. Had not media very close to film offered similar gratifications? Had not media very close to film offered similar gratifications? The artist photographers preferred what they considered aesthetically attractive compositions to searching explorations of nature. And immediately before the arrival of the motion picture camera, magic lantern performances indulge in the projection of religious themes, Walter Scott novels, and Shakespearean dramas. Yet, even though Millet did not take advantage of the camera's ability to record and reveal the physical world, he increasingly created his illusion with the aid of techniques peculiar to the medium. Some he found by accident when taking shots of the Paris Place de l'Opera. He had to discontinue the shooting because the celluloid strip did not move as it should. The surprising result was a film in which, for no reason at all, a bus abruptly transformed itself into a hearse. True, Lumiere also was not disinclined to have a sequence of events unfold in reverse, but Millet was the first to exploit cinematic devices systematically, drawing on both photography and the stage. He innovated many techniques which were to play an enormous role in the future, among them the use of mask, multiple exposure, superimposition as a means of summoning ghosts, the lapse dissolve, etc. And through his ingenuity in using these techniques, he added a touch of cinema to his playful narratives and magic tricks. Stage traps ceased to be indispensable. Sleights of hand yielded to incredible metamorphoses which film alone was able to accomplish. Illusion produced in this climate depended on another kind of craftsmanship than the magicians. It was cinematic illusion, and as such went far beyond theatrical make-believe. Millet's The Haunted Castle, La Manière du Diable, quote, is conceivable only in the cinema, and due to the cinema, end quote, says Henry Laguerre, one of the best connoisseurs of the primitive era. Notwithstanding his film sense, however, Millet still remained the theater director he had been. He used photography in a pre-photographic spirit for the reproduction of a papier-mâché universe inspired by stage traditions. In one of his greatest films, A Trip to the Moon, Le Voyage dans la Lune, the moon harbors a grimacing man in the moon, and the stars are bullseyes studded with the pretty faces of music hall girls. By the same token, his actors bowed to the audience as if they performed on the stage. Much of his films differed from the theater on a technical plane. They failed to transcend its scope by incorporating genuinely cinematic objects. This also explains why Millet, for all his inventiveness, never thought of moving his camera. The stationary camera perpetuated the spectator's relation to the stage. His ideal spectator was the traditional theater goer, child or adult. There seems to be some truth in the observation that as people grow older, they instinctively withdraw to the positions from which they see out of struggle and conquer. In his later years, Millet more and more turned from theatrical film to film theater, producing Ferrets, which recalled the Paris Chalet pageants. The realistic tendency. In following the realistic tendency, films go beyond photography in two respects. First, they picture movement itself, not only one or another of its phases, but what kinds of movements do they picture? ? In the primitive era, when the camera was fixed to the ground, it was natural for filmmakers to concentrate on moving material phenomena. Life on the screen was life only if it manifested itself through external or, objective, motion. As cinematic techniques developed, films increasingly drew on camera mobility and editing devices to deliver their messages. Although their strength still lay in the rendering and movements inaccessible to other media, these movements were no longer necessarily objective. In the technically mature film, subjective, movements that is, which the spectator is invited to execute, constantly compete with objective ones. The spectator may have to identify himself with a titillating panning, or the spectator may have to identify himself with a tilting, panning, or traveling camera, which insists on bringing motionless as well as moving objects to his attention, or an appropriate arrangement of shots may rush the audience through vast expanses of time and or space so as to make it witness almost simultaneously events in different periods and places. Nevertheless, the emphasis is now, as before, on objective movement. The medium seems to be partial to it. As Renee Clare puts it, if there is an aesthetics of the cinema, it can be summarized in one word, movement, The external movement of the objects perceived by the eye, to which we are today adding the inner movement of the action, The fact that he assigns a dominant role to external movement reflects, on a theoretical plane, a marked feature of his own earlier films, the ballet-like evolutions of their characters. Second, films may seize upon physical reality with all its manifold movements by means of an intermediary procedure which would seem to be less indispensable in photography: staging. In order to narrate an intrigue, the filmmaker is often obliged to stage not only the action but the surroundings as well. Now, this recourse to staging is most certainly legitimate if the staged world is made to appear as a faithful reproduction of the real one. The important thing is that studio-built settings convey the impression of actuality so that the spectator feels he is watching events which might have occurred in real life and have been photographed on the spot. Falling prey to an interesting misconception, Emile Villermoz champions, for the sake of, realism, settings which represent reality as seen by a perceptive painter. To his mind, they are more real than real life shots because they impart the essence of what such shots are showing. Yet, from the cinematic point of view, these allegedly realistic settings are no less stagey than would be, say, a cubist or abstract composition. Instead of staging the given raw material itself, they offer, so to speak, the gist of it. In other words, they suppress the very camera reality which film aims at incorporating. For this reason, the sensitive moviegoer will feel disturbed by them. The problems posed by films of fantasy, which as such show little concern for physical reality, may be considered later on. Strangely enough, it is entirely possible that a staged real-life event evokes a stronger illusion of reality on the screen than would the original event if it had been captured directly by the camera. The late Erno Metzner, who devised the setting for the studio-made mining disaster in Pabst's Camera Shaft, an episode with the ring of stark authenticity, insisted that candid shots of a real mining disaster would hardly have produced the same convincing effect. One may ask, on the other hand, whether reality can be staged so accurately that the camera eye will not detect any difference between the original and the copy. Blay Sinjars touches on this issue in a neat hypothetical experiment. He imagines two film scenes which are completely identical except for the fact that one has been shot on the Mont Blanc, the highest mountain of Europe, while the other was staged in the studio. His contention is that the former has a quality not found in the latter. There are on the mountain, says he, certain, quote, emanations, luminous or otherwise, which have worked on the film and given it a soul, end quote. Presumably, large parts of our environment, natural or man-made, resist duplication. The formative tendency. The filmmaker's formative faculties are offered opportunities far exceeding those offered the photographer. The reason is that film extends into dimensions which photography does not cover. These differ from each other according to area and composition. With respect to areas, filmmakers have never confined themselves to exploring only physical reality in front of the camera, but from the outset persistently tried to penetrate the realms of history and fantasy. Remember Millet. Even the realistic-minded Lumiere yielded to the popular demand for historical scenes. As for composition, the two most general types are the story film and the non-story film. The latter can be broken down into the experimental film and the film of fact, which on its part comprises, partially or totally, such subgenres as the film on art, the newsreel, and the documentary proper. It is easy to see that some of these dimensions are more likely than others to prompt the filmmaker to express his formative aspirations at the expense of the realistic tendency. As for areas considered that of fantasy, movie directors have at all times rendered dreams or visions with the aid of settings which are anything but realistic. Thus, in Red Shoes, Maura Shearer dances in a somnambulistic trance through fantastic worlds avowedly intended to project her unconscious mind. Agglomerates of landscape-like forms, near abstract shapes, and luscious color schemes, which have all the traits of stage imagery. Disengaged creativity thus drifts away from the basic concerns of the medium. Several dimensions of composition favor the same preferences. Most experimental films are not even designed to focus on physical existence, and practically all films following the lines of a theatrical story evolve narratives whose significance overshadows that of the raw material of nature used for their implementation. For the rest, the filmmaker's formative endeavors may also impinge on his realistic loyalties in dimensions which, because of their emphasis on physical reality, do not normally invite such encroachments. There are enough documentaries with real life shots which merely serve to illustrate some self-contained oral commentary. Clashes between the two tendencies. Films which combine two or more dimensions are very frequent. For instance, many a movie featuring an everyday incident includes a dreamlike sequence or a documentary passage. Some such combinations may lead to overt clashes between the realistic and formative tendencies. This happens whenever a filmmaker bent on creating an imaginary universe from freely staged material also feels under an obligation to draw on camera reality. In his Hamlet, Laurence Olivier has the cast move about in a studio-built, conspicuously stagey Elsinore, whose labyrinthine architecture seems calculated to reflect Hamlet's unfathomable being. Shut off from our real-life environment, this bizarre structure would spread over the whole of the film were it not for a small, otherwise insignificant scene in which the real ocean outside the dream orbit is shown. But no sooner does the photographed ocean appear than the spectator experiences something like a shock. He cannot help recognizing that this little scene is an outright intrusion, that it abruptly introduces an element incompatible with the rest of the imagery. How he then reacts to it depends upon his sensibilities. Those indifferent to the peculiarities of the medium, and therefore unquestioningly accepting the staged Elsinore, are likely to resent the unexpected emergence of crude nature as a letdown, while those more sensitive to the properties of film will in a flash realize the make-believe character of the castle's mythical splendor. Another case in point is Renato Castanelli's Romeo and Juliet. This attempt to stage Shakespeare in natural surroundings obviously rests upon the belief that camera reality and the poetic reality of Shakespeare verse can be made to fuse into each other. Yet the dialogue as well as the intrigue establish a universe so remote from the chance world of real Verona streets and ramparts that all the scenes in which the two disparate worlds are seen merging tend to affect one as an unnatural alliance between conflicting forces. Actually, collisions of this kind are by no means the rule. Rather, there is ample evidence to suggest that the two tendencies which sway the medium may be interrelated in various other ways. Since some of these relationships between realistic and formative efforts can be assumed to be aesthetically more gratifying than the rest, the next step is to try to define them. The cinematic approach. Hold on. 95. One moment. Okay, yeah, I'll read that one. 95. Okay, 95. The cinematic approach. It follows from what has been said in the preceding chapter that films may claim aesthetic validity if they build from their basic properties, like photographs. That is, they must record and reveal physical reality. I have already dealt with the possible counter-argument that media peculiarities are in general too elusive to serve as a criterion. For obvious reasons, it does not apply to the cinematic medium either. Yet other objection suggests itself. One might argue that too exclusive an emphasis on the medium's primary relation to physical reality tends to put film in a straitjacket. This objection finds support in the many existing films which are completely unconcerned about the representation of nature. There is the abstract experimental film. There is an unending succession of, quote, photoplays, end quote, or theatrical films which do not picture real life material for its own sake, but use it to build up action after the manner of the stage. And there are the many films of fantasy which neglect the external world and freely compose dreams or visions. The old German expressionist films went far in this direction. One of their champions, the German art critic Hermann G. Schafferer, even eulogizes expressionism on the screen for its remoteness from photographic life. Why, then, should these genres be called less, quote, cinematic, end quote, than films concentrating on physical existence, question mark? The answer is, of course, that it is the latter alone which afford insight and enjoyment otherwise unattainable. True, in view of all the genres which do not cultivate outer reality and yet are here to stay, this answer sounds somewhat dogmatic, but perhaps it will be found more justifiable in the light of the following two considerations. First, favorable response to a genre need not depend on its adequacy to the medium from which it issues. As a matter of fact, many a genre has a hold on the audience because it caters to widespread social and cultural demands. It is and remains popular for reasons which do not involve questions of aesthetic legitimacy. Thus, the photoplay has succeeded in perpetuating itself, even though most responsible critics are agreed that it goes against the grain of film. Yet the public, which feels attracted, for instance, by the screen version of yet the public which feels attracted, for instance, by the screen version of Death of a Salesman, likes the version for the very virtues which made the Broadway play a hit, and does not in the least care whether or not it has any specifically cinematic merits. Second, let us, for the sake of argument, assume that my definition of aesthetic validity is actually one-sided, that it results from a bias for one particular, if important, type of cinematic activities, and hence is unlikely to take into account, say, the possibilities of hybrid genres or the influence of the medium's non-photographic components. But this does not necessarily speak against the propriety of that definition. In a strategic interest, it is often more advisable to loosen up initial one-sidedness, provided it is well founded, than to start from all too Catholic premises and then try to make them specific. The latter alternative runs the risk of blurring differences between the media because it rarely leads far enough away from the generalities postulated at the outset. Its danger is that it tends to entail a confusion of the arts. When Eisenstein, the theoretician, began to stress the similarities between the cinema and the traditional art media, identifying film as their ultimate fulfillment, Eisenstein, the artist, increasingly trespassed the boundaries that separate film from elaborate theatrical spectacles. Think of his Alexander Nevsky and the operatic aspects of his Ivan the Terrible. In strict analogy to the term, quote, photographic approach, end quote, the filmmaker's approach is called, quote, cinematic, end quote. If it acknowledges the basic aesthetic principle, it is evident that the cinematic approach materializes in all films which follow the realistic tendency. This implies that even films almost devoid of creative aspirations, such as newsreels, scientific or educational films, artless documentaries, etc., are tenable propositions from an aesthetic point of view, presumably more so than films which, for all their artistry, pay little attention to the given outer world. But as with photographic reportage, newsreels and the like meet only the minimum requirement. What is of the essence in film, no less than photography, is the invention of the filmmaker's formative energies in all the dimensions which the medium has come to cover. He may feature his impressions of this or that segment of physical existence in documentary fashion, transfer hallucinations and mental images to the screen, indulge in the rendering of rhythmical patterns, narrate a human interest story, etc. All these creative efforts are in keeping with the cinematic approach as long as they benefit in some way or other the medium's substantive concern with our visible world. As in photography, everything depends on the, quote, right, end quote, balance between the realistic tendency and the formative tendency, and the two tendencies are well balanced if the latter does not try to overwhelm the former, but eventually follows its lead. The issue of art. When calling the cinema an art medium, people usually think of films which resemble the traditional works of art in that they are free creations rather than explorations of nature. These films organize the raw material to which they resort into some sufficient composition instead of accepting it as an element in its own right. In other words, their underlying formative impulses are so strong that they defeat the cinematic approach with its concern for camera reality. Among the film types customarily considered art are, for instance, the above-mentioned German expressionist films of the years after World War I, conceived in a painterly spirit, they seem to implement the formula of Herman Worm, one of the designers of the cabinet of Dr. Caligari settings, who claimed that, quote, films must be drawings brought to life, end quote. Here also belongs many in experimental film. All in all, films of this type are not only tended as autonomous wholes, but frequently ignore physical reality or exploit it for purposes alien to photographic veracity. By the same token, there is an inclination to classify as works of art feature films which combine forceful artistic composition with devotion to significant subjects and values. This would apply to a number of adaptations of great stage plays and other literary works. Yet such a usage of the term, quote, art, end quote, in the traditional sense is misleading. It lends support to the belief that artistic qualities must be attributed precisely to films which neglect the medium's recording obligations in an attempt to rival achievements in the films or in the fields of the fine arts, the theater, or literature. In consequence, this usage tends to obscure the aesthetic value of films which are really true to the medium. If the term, quote, art, end quote, is reserved for productions like Hamlet or Death of a Salesman, one will find it difficult indeed to appreciate properly the large amount of creativity that goes into many a documentary capturing material phenomena for their own sake. Take Ivan's Reign or Flaherty's Nanook, documentary saturated with formative intentions. Like any selective photographer, their creators have all the traits of the imaginative reader and curious explorer, and their readings and discoveries result from full absorption in the given material and significant choices. Add to this that some of the crafts needed in the cinematic process, especially editing, represent tasks with which the photographer is not confronted, and they too lay claim to the filmmaker's creative powers. This leads straight to a terminological dilemma. Due to its fixed meaning, the concept of art does not and cannot cover truly, quote, cinematic, end quote, films. Films, that is, which incorporate aspects of physical reality with a view to making us experience them. And yet, it is they, not the films reminiscent of traditional art works, which are valid aesthetically. If film is an art at all, it certainly should not be confused with the established arts. There may be some justification in loosely applying this fragile concept to such films as Nanook or Paysan or Potemkin, which are deeply steeped in camera life. But in defining them as art, it must always be kept in mind that even the most creative filmmaker but in defining them as art, it must always be kept in mind that even the most creative filmmaker is much less independent of nature in the raw than the painter or poet. That his creativity manifests itself in letting nature in and penetrating it. And I was reading Basic Concepts, Chapter 2, Basic Concepts in Theory of Film, The Redemption of Physical Reality by Siegfried Kracauer.